DEFCON. Forgot what I was going to say, but help me welcome Shuhao from Taiwan on his talk, Spoofing to Tunneling.
Okay, thank you everyone. So let's start the talk. Hi, I'm Suhao from Taiwan. And this is my first time to present at DEFCON, and also my first time at DEFCON, and also my first time at Vegas, and not my first time in US. Okay, so thank you all for joining my session. So I'm excited to share some practical red team networking techniques with you today. So I guess we can get started. Okay. So now let me take you into a typical day in my IT life, seeing my intranet LDAP server log. And there's a login from Frank. And there's a login from Bob. And then, wow, there's an invalid login from a public IP, 9.9.9.9. And how and why this can happen? This is an intranet server without no destination NAT. So, okay, as an IT, I'll bandit that bad IP. But a second later, there's another IP attacking my server again. So how is that possible? That someone can use a public IP address to attack our intranet server. This is the key point that we are going to discuss in this talk. This presentation will explore ways of low-level network penetration through various external protocoling. This technique can be used for advanced red team exercise or can be blocked before they are abused by malicious attackers in your corporate networks. Before we dive into the details, let me briefly introduce myself. Hi, I'm Su Hao Tong from Taiwan, and I now is a red teamer trade researcher at Trimichael, and I graduated from Tsinghua University in Taiwan and a former HITCON president. I love to play something with networks and network protocols. I started this research for fun, and it turned out that it is great importance to general network security. So I'm sharing my GitHub account here, where you can find all the tools and material of this research. So this is today's agenda. First, I will share some new rating techniques using IP spoofing and how we can use that for initial access. Then, I will reveal the nightmare of VXLAN, including terminal hijacking and how buggy routing protocols can lead to IP hijacking and even domain compromise. And finally, I'll wrap up with some key takeaways before we move on to the Q&A. So first, I want to talk about some spoofing source IP in the public network, also known as WAN. We all know that even in recent years, packet spoofing is still possible on public networks. Please note that all the IP addresses are example IP address, not any common node public IPs. An attacker with the IP address 2.2.2.2 can send a DNS request with a source IP of 3.3.3.3. That does not belong to itself. And 1.1.1 will receive the packet, and it has no way to verify whether the packet is a spoofed packet or a valid one. And it will send the DNS response to the 3.3.3.3. So the 3.3.3.3 will receive the DNS response without making a request. This is a typical DDoS DNS amplification attack, and it still works nowadays. Next, I want to dive into the company network infrastructure, how IT will block a computer from accessing the public network for security purpose. So for the best practice, when a packet is sent from a crucial server to a public IP, it will arrive to the firewall, and the firewall will drop the packet. However, we see some IT just disabled the NAT mechanism on the router. So the packet will still forward out to the wide area network. And the remote server will see and receive that packet and see that source IP is not valid. So it will whether drop that package or respond to an unknown address. And the client will not receive the message. So when your code is completely a mess, but it still works because the client still not receive any response. So the client is not connected to the internet. So if we consider both situations together, what would happen if we spoof the source IP address on the intranet? Imagine a rating scenario. The attacker hacked a company's device, like .1.3. It can create a tunnel between the C2 server and the compromised device. After that, it can create a DNS request through the tunnel, which source IP is the attacker public IP, which is 9.9.9.9. When the packet arrives the compromised device, it will forward the packet to the company intranet router. After the router will receive the packet, it will look up its routing table and forward the package to the second victim. As we know, if there is no firewall for the second victim, .1.1.2, the response package will send back to the attacker through the public internet. Then, the attacker will receive the packet with there is no evidence that the packet is come from .1.3. The entire TCP or UDP string only shows the IP source IP is 9.9.9 and IP source 192.168.1.2. So why IR is hard? In typical lateral movement attacks, the attacker used the IP address for previous compromised machine to target to the next system. This means when the alarm being triggered, an IR team could simply use network log to trace the attacker path from one compromised machine to the previous one. The IR team could find the relevant log on the previous compromised machine and identify the initial access point. And then the IR team will shut down the entire attack chain step by step. However, when spoofing techniques are involved, the source IP in the log will not be the previous compromised machine. So the IR team will not be able to find the attacker path. They could only see a public IP is attacking their domain controller. Thus, the previous compromised machine will not be caught, even if the alarm has triggered, and it can change to another public source IP to continue the attack chain if the source IP is banded. Overlooking the attack path, the malicious package source and destination IPs only shows 9.9.9.9 and private IP .1.2. Thus, no one will know the previous compromised machine is .1.3. On the other hand, the tunneled IP is a HTTP traffic with a source IP of 7.7.7.7. So if the 9.9.9 is banded, the attacker can simply switch another public IP and attack the same target or different target. The IR team would need to check every router for layer 2 port logs in order to identify the compromised machine. Also, the source MAC address can also be forged at the first hop. So what if the ISP filter package with a private source IP address? We can use H.323 NAT pass-through to enable a temporary destination NAT. The attacker can send a special package to 9.9.9.9, which is its C2 server. The NAT router will then create a temporary destination NAT rule for a private IP 1.3 port 445 and open to its public IP port 445. This allows attacker to access private IP 1.3 on port 445 via 9.9.9.9. So here's a quick demo. We can see that .241 has a web server at 8080. Initially, the attacker .142 could not access the intranet web server via the public IP. After we create a server and send a H.323 packet from the compromised machine, we receive a packet from the victim routers, and we know that the router gives me a DNANT port to connect to the intranet web server. Also, we can see that the web log source IP is from a public IP rather than a private IP. So let's create a breakpoint for the attack chain. Another method discovered by Jimmy Cai involves spoofing a fake TCP sync packet from the compromised device, using the next target IP as the source IP address, which is .1.3 for now, and sending it to the attacker's server. The SNAT mechanism can be abused as a destination NAT to connect an intranet service. So this is a second quick demo. We can see that the device at .35 has a web server running at 8080. Initially, the attacker at .131 could not access the intranet web server via the public IP. After we spoof a sync package from the compromised device using the next target IP and the port as source, and send it to the attacker server, the router will create a source destination NAT, but we can abuse this role as a destination NAT. So the SNAT mechanism will allow us to connect to the intranet web server. Additionally, we can see that the web server log shows the source IP as a public IP rather than the private one. So let's also create a breakpoint in the attack chain. So next, can we replace the terminal with official VPN? The answer is yes in some cases. There are many commercial SSL VPN solutions that can spoof the source IP from the client. As shown in the diagram, commercial SSL VPN like those discussed as CyberSec 2025 may allow this behavior. On the other hand, whether open source VPN solutions like WireGuard or OpenVPN are affected depends on their configuration. So where's the initial access? Do we have a chance to do this without an initial foothold in intranet? Can we use any existing terminal? The answer is yes. On the internet exchange, everyone is on the same layer 2 network. Attacker can set a private network range as the next hop to the router of the company you want to attack. Also, the second method, we can abuse existing terminals such as GRE, IPIP, or SIT terminal. But again, a good firewall configuration could cause this fail. So in the internet exchange, if we compromise a router at an internet exchange, or we can just rent a IXP VM to access an internet exchange, we can force a private subnet as the next hop to the victim company router. And then we can create a connection using our own public IP as the source IP and a private subnet as a destination. The victim router will forward the packet to its intranet via its routing table, and the intranet target will respond to the attacker to its public IP because the package source IP is a public one. On the other hand, we can abuse existing internal like GRE. So first, what is a GRE? GRE is a stateless layer 3 kernel. This is widely used because it is easy to set up by only setting its protocol GRE public IP and GRE interface IP and its routing table, which is next hop. Nowadays, there are still a lot of companies that use GRE, like Cloudflare, Magic Transit, and its customer. They can choose between IPsec or GRE, and IPsec is safer. And AWS Transit Gateway also supports GRE kernel, but sadly, it's used for internal networking only. Also, Security Week reports that APT groups like Salt Typhoon create GRE kernels to collect traffic from compromised device. Last, a lot of companies also use GRE kernel, but we don't know. So how does GRE works? When a packet wants to go through a GRE kernel, the kernel will pack the packet with a GRE header and send it over the public internet. At the receiver side, the GRE packet is unpacked, and the inner packet is forwarded according to its routing table. GRE is stateless and doesn't provide any encryption, which means it is possible for everyone can spoof a GRE packet via public network. For example, a private IP .1.2 wants to send a packet to another site, .2.2. The packet will send to its default gateway. And because of it is a GRE kernel, the gateway router will add a GRE header to the packet and then send it through the public internet. After the GRE packet arrives at the 2.2, it will remove the GRE header and forward the inner packet according to its routing table. And then the 2.2 receives the packet. And if it wants to respond to the packet, the vice versa. The packet will send back to its default gateway and add the GRE header and send back to the 1.1.1 router and remove the GRE header and send it back to the 1.2. So, how do we find a GRE kernel? We can use OSINT techniques. For example, we can search for NetFloor dashboard like Arcphoto on Google and filter for GRE traffic. This way, we can obtain the IP address on both ends of the kernel. Other OSINT techniques can also help too. Also, we can use GRE spoofing techniques to scan for existing GRE kernel. First, we can create a GRE kernel using the command provided above. Then we can craft a GRE packet with a spoofed source IP address, one not belong to us, and send it over the public network to the victim. If the victim has a GRE peer configured with the GRE packet source IP, for example, 1.1.1, it will decapsulate the inner packet and process it according to its routing table and forward to the inner packet. So, we can create and send many packets with different source IP address to brute force the correct victim peer. If the victim does not recognize the source IP as a known peer, it will drop the packet. On the other hand, if the source IP matches one of the victim known peers, the victim will accept the GRE packet and forward the inner packet according to its routing table. For scanning purpose, we set the destination of the inner packet to the victim itself. So, the victim will immediately reply the inner packet with an ICMP response and send it back to the attacker. Then we can identify the victim GRE internal peer IP address by its ID finder and sequence. We can encode the information into ICMP ID finder and sequence field, which together can represent all 255 to the power of 4 possible IPv4 address. We also create a scanner script on GitHub. As you can see, when the GRE source address matches the remote GRE peer address, we can get an ICMP reply. Then we can put everything together to get an initial access. Let's imagine a scenario. The victim 1.1.1 has a GRE internal with 2.2.2. An attacker can forge a GRE packet that appears to be sent from 2.2.2. The inner packet is a DNS request sent from the provider IP 3.3.3 to an internal network IP. When the packet arrives, the victim will trust and use the GRE packet because it claims to come from 2.2.2.2. Then, the victim will unpack the GRE packet and discover that contains a DNS request, which destination is a private network IP. The victim will then forward the packet to its company intranet based on its routing table. Then, when the internal DNS server receives the DNS packet, it will respond and send the reply through the public internet to the attacker server. Thus, the attacker can interact with service on the victim intranet, including those using the TCP protocol. We have created a demo lab. The architecture is illustrated in the diagram. We have a target router, which GRE peer is 1.1.1. And there's an intranet web server, which public network is 1.2. So the web server is hosted on 1.2, and the server can access the public network via SNAT. On the other hand, the router has a GRE terminal, and it can directly access the intranet web server. And also, he has a public IP, and then we can see that there's a GRE terminal. The peer is 1.1.1.1. So initially, the attacker at IP address .142 cannot access the private network 192.168.1.2. Then the attacker can create a spoofed GRE terminal via the command shown above to the victim router and directly send traffic to the private address 1.2 through the fake terminal. Then the attacker can direct access and interact with the internal web server. Similarly, if the layer 2 terminal like GRE tab, also, if we can link the victim MAC address, we can also exploit this in the same way. It is common to use the SNMP protocol to obtain this. For a short TLDR summary, when a company does not configure its firewall and use stateless on encrypted terminal, even if it's a legacy configuration, an attacker can exploit this terminal for initial access to the intranet. So then, we'll reveal a nightmare of default configuration of VXLAN. So what is a VXLAN? VXLAN is the stateless and unencrypted layer 2 terminal. It packs layer 2 Ethernet frame into a layer 4 UDP packet. Each subnet is uniquely identified by a name called VNI. We can configure VXLAN terminal similar to the GRE by giving the remote IP, local IP, and destination port and VNI. However, this configuration is vulnerable. Based on the previous configuration, set up a standard VXLAN peer is easy as usual. How about hijacking a VXLAN terminal? Yes, here's the only difference. The only thing you have to change is your local IP argument. So why does this happen? Does the Linux kernel doesn't check the source IP for VXLAN packets? How does it accept VXLAN packet with a valid VNI and port, even if the source IP is not configured? After looking at the Linux memo, you will see that this is a feature, but not a bug. But this feature is insecure, and it turned on by default. Before reporting, router OS couldn't turn this feature down. Now you can change the setting to off, but it's still on by default. So what's happened when learning is enabled in VXLAN? Normally, when a configured peer sends a VXLAN packet, the kernel will add its MAC address to the FDB, also known as forwarding database table, shown at the bottom on the slide. The next time a packet needed to be sent to the destination MAC address that is listed in the FDB table, the kernel pack and send the packet to the remote location using the information from the FDB table. Similarly, when learning mode is enabled, any VXLAN packet with a valid VNI and port will be added to the FDB table. Also, the remote IP could be any IP on the internet. Thus, an attacker 9.9.9.9 can create a VXLAN packet with a MAC address, which is broadcast address FFFFFF. And the Linux kernel will add this MAC address to the list. Then, when the kernel wants to send a broadcast package on the VXLAN interface, it will look up the FDB table and then send it to the attacker server, which is 9.9.9.9. So we know how VXLAN works. How do we get the information that we can hijack a VXLAN? We know our own IP, but we don't know the victim's IP, or VNI, or VXLAN inner subnet. However, all this information can be obtained by a simple scan. An attacker can discover the victim IP port and VNI by sending numerous packets. So let's focus on how to determine the VXLAN inner subnet range. We can gather information by sending a single VXLAN packet where both the source and destination MAC address are set to the broadcast address. Then, when an ARP request sent from the VXLAN interface, they will also send a copy to the attacker. Another method involves sending a neighbor discover protocol packet. When a router OS receives a broadcast neighbor discover protocol (NDP) message, it will respond to the broadcasting MAC address with its own IP and MAC address. Thus, we can send numerous VXLAN packets with different VNI and port configuration. Each contains an inner NDP packet where both the source and destination MAC address are set to the broadcast address. When the VNIM port matches the victim configuration, the victim device will add the attacker's IP to its FTP table. Then, the victim unpacks the VXLAN package and see that it is a NDP request. The victim router replies to the NDP packet and try to send the response to the broadcast MAC address. It checks the FTP table and finds like the destination is 9.9.9.9, which is the attacker IP. So the router will send the packet to the attacker. Then the attacker has everything to hijack the terminal. We create a scanner. We can discover the victim IP port and VNI by sending numerous packets. VXLAN has default port 4789 and 8472, and VNI usually smaller than 100. Here's a scanner link. We have also created a lab for VXLAN scanner demonstration, which include a router OS router and a web server. So for demo, we can see that the scanner aims to scan the target at .200. The scanner sends numerous packets with different default ports and different VNIs. Later, we can receive an NDP reply with VNI 42 and port 8472. The inner subnet is 10.0.0.1. Then, by simplifying, we can simply create a VXLAN with the information above. We can direct access the VXLAN intranet server. We also scan for insecure VXLAN configuration worldwide. Usually, using VNI equals 1 and default ports. We found that more than 900 VXLAN endpoints respond to the scanner. Additionally, there are 4,000 IPs inside the VXLAN subnet. Some of these are public IP, which means we can hijack public IPs. Additionally, some endpoints reply to numerous broadcast packets combined with the IP spoofing. This can lead to DDoS attack. Lastly, we see some VXLAN packets have source IP that are private address. This raises a question. Why are the private address being used as a source IP on the VXLAN packet? So, if I use VXLAN in an encrypted terminal, I am safe? The answer is no. VXLAN still accepts traffic in different interfaces. So if you have a public IP interface and also you create a VXLAN interface, it can be scanned and hijacked. For TLDR, we can hijack a VXLAN terminal using only 3 pieces of concept: the victim IP address, the VXLAN port, and the VNI. There's no need to know the peer IP and internal IP address. Furthermore, if your network setup including a public IP address and VXLAN on any interface, it is highly vulnerable. So what can hacker do after hijacking a VXLAN terminal? Not only can attacker gaining initial access to the company intranet, but also they can hijack IP communication or perform a man-in-the-middle attack between the two sites. Additionally, attacker can target layer 2 network service such as exploiting RADVD to RCE vulnerabilities. Incident response is challenging because the source IP cannot be trusted. Moreover, these terminals often run routing protocols like BGP or OSPF. Attackers can hijack IPs that are even not transmissioning through that terminal. such as those of a domain controller or a EXXI server. So what is a routing protocol? It is a protocol like router can exchange routes and network information with other routers. Routing protocols help router to dynamically learn about the networks around them and to determine the best path for forwarding the packet. For example, router A has a subnet 192.168.1.0/24, and the router C could learn the routes from router B by routing protocols. We often see companies use VXLAN terminal to connect two sites with routing protocols. But when we combine this with the learning feature, we can hijack routers A IP. Then we can connect to the routing protocols and announce domain controllers IP in the routing protocols with /22. Other routers will receive and trust the routing prefix and redirect the domain controller's traffic to the attacker because the route is more suspicious, smaller than the LAN subnet. We have summarized the potential impact of hijacking different service IP. If an attacker hijacks the IP of domain controller and NTLM is possible, meaning SMB signing is disabled or ADCS ESC8 is present, they can take over the entire domain. If an attacker hijacks the IP of vSphere, Proxmox, or any HTTPS service, and the original SSL certificate is unsigned or not valid, user may not be noticed. And the attacker can then take over the account or the full server. In short, hijacking this service IP can lead to account takeover, deny of service, DNS hijack, or even full domain compromise or server compromise. And here's a bonus. A bad configuration in the company's OSPF lead to IP hijacking. This attack vector has been published for years, and we actually observed it during our rating scenario. Yet, very few people discuss it. Do you check and use a TCP dump after you get into an intranet? If you see this on the victim intranet, it might be vulnerable. Just like the exploitation method described in the previous slide, if you see a hello package, there is a highly possible that you can directly establish an OSPF connection with the router and hijack the routes. So, in short, if we connect to the OSPF, we can hijack the domain controller again and get previous escalation. Last, there are some key takeaways. Here's the key takeaways for Blue Team. First, check all unencrypted terminals in your company's network. If you find any, don't use them. This includes protocols like GRE, IPIP, SIT, GRE tab, and VXLAN. These terminals are not secure and can be abused by attackers. Next, make sure you have secure firewall in place. Your firewall should filter outbound intranet traffic, especially SYN-ACK packet, which is a response from server. Also, check for IP spoofing in your intranet. Ideally, all ISPs should fill out spoofed IP address, but in reality, this is rarely possible. Check if OSPF is not enabled on ports between routers. It's only enabled on ports between routers. OSPF should not open on unnecessary port. Monitor your routing prefix for any anomalies. unaccepted change in router protocol can indicate an ongoing attack. Finally, set up the minimum accept prefix size in your routing protocol, for example, /24. In summary, avoid unencrypted terminals, secure your firewall, filter for IP spoofing, restrict OSPF, monitoring routing, and enforce minimum prefix size. And here's the takeaway for rating. First, scan or use OSINT techniques to find victims on encrypted terminals. These can be entry point into the network. Once you are inside the intranet, check the victim's network setup for spoofing. Use source IP spoofing techniques during high-risk scanning to avoid detection. Look for OSPF hello message to identify active routing protocols and potential attack path. Scan for misconfiguration VXLAN terminal. If you find a vulnerable terminal, hijack it to get initial access. Abuse routing protocols and hijack IP for lateral movement and privilege escalation. Rating can continue looking for more vulnerable protocol in future. Remember, scan, find, hacked. And here are some key takeaways for tool makers. First, implement an intranet IP spoofing command and control tools. Develop automated tools to test possible of IP spoofing within a target intranet. Automation save times. Create automated correction mechanism for mismatch between IP destination and source address in the same TCP session. Some routers still perform SNAT, even the packet is a server response. Automate the process of sending H.323 package or a new TCP packet to trigger a routing NAT mechanism, especially for ISP that filter private IP as a source IP address. Develop tools for automation OSPF IP hijacking attacks. Finally, implement a more efficient GRE scanner for global scanning, similar to what MaxScan does for TCP. So thank you, everyone.